Welcome to AskPsychSessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. That's bit.ly/AskPsychSessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Gerardo Rarmiez from Ball State University. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Before I tell everyone how I found out about you and your work, could you tell the listeners about who you are, what your research and PhD background is, and a little bit about Ball State for people that aren't familiar with it, please?
Oh, sure. So I got my PhD from the University of Chicago in cognitive psychology and experimental psychology. After that, I went to do a postdoc at UCLA, and that led to an assistant professor position at UCLA. I was part of the ed psych and the development area. So it was like a dual position. I did that for a couple of years and decided to come here to Ball State, where I've been here for about 6 years now. What do I study? I study primarily right now. Well, I've been studying a lot of things. I think the big theme around a lot of my work has been emotion and education. I've studied emotion and math in terms of things like math anxiety and the people who contribute to children's math anxiety. But more recently, I think, and this came out of my work here at Ball State, I was teaching teacher education majors, which is very different, in my opinion, from psych majors. And that really led me to question a lot of my assumptions about students and what's good learning and teaching. And so more recently, my interests have really centered around how do you enhance students' cultural capital, and how do we create a validating classroom environment that makes students want to have a warm relationship with you.
Perfect. And a perfect segue for why I got in touch, because you were gracious enough to come to the Psychonomic Society meeting this year and be part of our special symposium about STEM and education and belonging. And so I reached out because the work that you talked about with cultural capital, some of that was new to me, and that makes me guess that maybe it's new to our listeners. So would you be willing to talk a little bit more about just starting with what is cultural capital and why does it matter, please?
So cultural capital is sort of those hidden resources and ways of doing things that we oftentimes neglect to tell other people about. So in a college setting, that might be how to go to office hours, what the point of office hours are, what's the point of tutoring, how do you assertively walk up to students and form a study group. They're essentially ways of being successful in college that are not always discussed or talked about. Some people refer to this as the hidden curriculum. And so I got to say that in a lot of ways, this is a lot of research. And a lot of times people will critique that kind of thing. They'll say, research, that can't be valuable. I don't know. I take a different view. And the reason why I bring this up is just because I really identify with what I presented. Because I was a first gen student myself, and there's a lot of things about college that I just did not understand, and I felt really frustrated constantly and really angry, quite frankly, when it seemed like everyone seemed to know how to do things, but I didn't. It made me feel really inadequate. So yeah, a lot of my work right now is focused on teaching cultural capital, so that students don't have the kind of experiences that I had. Students know exactly what are the hidden rules for success.
Very important. I'm guessing that I'm not the only one whose institution is seeing more and more first generation students in their first year classes. And we, I think sometimes can be talking too abstractly about this idea of a 6-year graduation rate and forget that these are individual human beings that we're talking about completing or not completing degrees. And I'm going to guess Ball State's tuition as a public institution, yes, might be less than Seton Hall, but it's still a lot of money.
Yeah, it's a public institution. A lot of it is, a lot of the students who come here are students from Indiana. Our university is primarily known for their architecture and school of education. Yeah, and I would say that this issue of cultural capital really goes beyond just undergrads. I think it's true of grad students. A lot of us teach in PhD programs, and for most of our students, they're first generation PhD students, right? And a lot of PhD students really value and honor autonomy, and that's great. But sometimes we don't do such a good job of teaching students how to write a literature review, how to set up a meeting, how to write a code book. So I think this issue is definitely relevant for undergrads, but it's really relevant for all kinds of people in different positions where those hidden rules are not communicated explicitly.
And so what are some good first steps that we can take to start making those more explicit? My memory is correct, you were working with some faculty in some of the larger first year lecture courses, right? To do this work?
Yes. And in my work, I primarily focus on first year undergrad courses, first year students and first gen students in particular. Basically what we did in that study was we created these short video clips that told them what office hours are for, how to manage your time, and some other very common challenges that first generation college students have. And our choice for these videos was informed by other first generation students who were telling us what they didn't understand and they wanted some help with. I would say that one concrete way of helping with this issue of cultural capital is to explicitly teach some of this capital. And of course, that can be really burdensome. So I'd say create videos, and but not just create any videos. I think you got to honor students where they are. A lot of students, even though they may not know how to do this or that, they don't want to watch a 40-minute video. They want to watch quick 2-3 minute videos that teach them what they need to know right now. I would say meet students where they are, give them quick, brief, and if possible, fun clips that are easily accessible. I've noticed in my classes that students will complete assignments much quicker if I simply take the time to explain the assignment as opposed to telling them, go read the syllabus.
Big fan of transparency as well. I will second that notion. Maybe we'll come back to what you were just talking about, but as you were sort of speaking about first generation students and me thinking about how I want to approach them, I'm guessing what I'm also unaware of, it was through this podcast that I even learned the idea of a deficit model. That's not something they taught me in a COG program. Have you found ways also that we would be able to elevate the really great things that first generation students are bringing into our university? What cultural capital maybe am I missing on the positive side of things in addition to helping them succeed? I always like to look for space where I'm not recognizing I never thought about doing that way. Thank you for introducing me to this.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So a lot of cognitive psychologists, we're not oftentimes discussing this asset versus deficit perspective, but I actually think it's really important, not only for teaching, but for conceptualizing how I think about projects. So a lot of times in my work, I talk about deficit. So I say students don't have this, or they lack this. And so in a lot of my research, I conceptualize helping with that issue by filling students with this thing. So students lack cultural capital, so I'm going to give it to them. And, that framework is helpful for thinking. It's been, instrumental in a lot of my career, but there are different frameworks. An asset-based framework is really asking, well, what do students already have? What's a strength that they have that we can build upon, right? So, for instance, let's think about the suggestion I just made. There's two different ways of framing it. One way of framing it is students lack cultural capital, so I'm going to give it to them. That's a well-intentioned, but ultimately deficit orientation. An asset orientation to the exact same issue would be, students are hungry to understand the hidden rules of academia, and I'm going to make a very brief assignment. I'm going to have them research how to go to office hours, right? So these first-gen students, there's some things they don't know, but they're thirsty for knowledge and they're thirsty for investigation. They got into college because they never took no for an answer. So I'm gonna make them go out there and figure out this one thing and create a video for it. And then I'm gonna create a catalog of videos of this hidden curriculum, right? So that would be an asset way of framing this. And what this asset way is essentially implying is It's not that you're lacking something. It's that you have certain strengths that I'm going to use to help address an issue that's going on that affects a lot of students.
Great. Thank you. And if maybe I can call back to my favorite moment of your presentation. You told us the best thing I could do was not be that professor, and referencing to what you just said a bit about making sure you have clear directions. And I think you mentioned making sure that your, Canvas or Blackboard or other LMS is organized. Would you mind talking for a few minutes about, because then I don't have a problem taking a deficit approach to me, right? Because I should. Yeah. That is a deficit in my teaching if I'm not creating a fluent. I studied fluency a lot for my, favorite memory illusion, right? I should be creating a fluent course experience. Would you mind talking about sure. What happens to students when we put up those, maybe sometimes intentional, but hopefully unintentional, just didn't think about their perspective?
Yeah, so a lot of times, so I'll talk to you about my experience. So when I was a first year here at Ball State and I was coming back, I was teaching the way I taught at UCLA. I taught the way I was taught, right? A lot of us don't get any training in teaching. So I just kept teaching the same way I always taught, which is I'd put up a study, I talk about the study, we think about some hypotheses, some interpretation of the results, and then we briefly talk about what does this mean for education. So I kept doing that, and I had a set of assignments that I wanted students to complete. And I noticed that my teacher education majors, they just weren't completing the assignments. They weren't paying attention, and my initial reaction and interpretation for that was, well, you guys are lazy. This is students at this university don't like to work hard. The intellectual caliber is just not quite there yet. And overall, lower quality student. But what I wasn't seeing at that time was that these are education majors. They don't really care about theory or research. What they need is usable knowledge. And that doesn't make them any less adequate of a student. They just want different things. And I also started to notice that a lot of students, when they complained to me, they were complaining about a lot of fixable things. They were saying, hey, why are you, the due dates are not on Canvas. Hey, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? They were telling me a lot of things that were, frankly, quite reasonable. But for some reason, I had this gut impulse to push back and say no. And I never really had a good reason. In fact, I did have reasons, but they're not very good. They were just made up reasons through tradition. So anyway, long story short, what I started to do was I started to, instead of licking my wounds after the course was over, I started to ask students at the very beginning of the semester, what can I do to avoid being that annoying professor? I've been that professor in the past. What can I do? And students surprisingly didn't say things like, oh, give us extensions, give us extra credit, don't be mean, don't challenge us. They weren't saying those kinds of things. They were saying a bunch of things that were incredibly actionable. They were saying things like, can you please put up the assignment due dates on Canvas? Because a lot of them, rely on the LMS, the calendar. They heavily rely on that. So if I put a due date in my syllabus, or if I announce a due date, it's just not good enough. It has to be on the calendar because they've got so many different requirements, right? So in that one example alone, my thinking shifted from, students are lazy, uninterested intellectually, to, wow, students are really busy and they have difficulties keeping up with all their requirements, and they need a little bit of help to figure out what's the next pressing deadline. So they would also tell me things like, can you please not insult us? Can you announce assignments weeks in advance as opposed to the day before they're due? All kinds of things that were completely actionable. And I was like, wow, your professors aren't doing that? And they're like, no, nobody does that. And I started to listen to them, and my course evals went from a 2 out of 5 to a 4.5 out of 5, all because I was actually listening to what they were saying instead of trying to impose on them this model of this lazy student simply because they didn't approach the class the way I approached it. And so when you listen to your students, you start to realize like, wow, a lot of students get frustrated easily because we make things unnecessarily difficult. We don't organize our Canvas page. We don't put due dates in the right places. We're just constantly frustrating students with a lot of our action or our inaction. And ever since then, my teaching has completely transformed. I would say that I take an approach where I try to reduce the extraneous cognitive load as much as possible. And that has had a much bigger impact on students' willingness to complete the assignments and to engage with me intellectually.
Great. I like that. That is a good teaching philosophy model, reducing extraneous cognitive load, right? There's your, that's it in a nutshell, right? Because what is that load doing, or what learning objective do I have on my syllabus that says you should be able to, persevere in this is some kind of video game, right? And I'm the dragon. That's not the environment I want. Well, terrific. This has all been very helpful. Lots for me to think about. I'm sure lots for our listeners to think about. But as I try to do, I only know 15 minutes worth of you and about 30 seconds of Googling. Is there anything that we did not get a chance to chat about that you would like to tell the listeners about student success, about misunderstanding educational psychology, anything?
Oh, sure.
The floor is yours.
Oh, sure. I think the one thing that I've just been so surprised repeatedly by the last year is a lot of what I try to be very evidence-based in my classroom. So I'll say, well, the research says X, Y, and Z. And a lot of my teacher education majors are constantly pushing back. They're like, that doesn't make any sense because of this and because of that. And I kept saying, yeah, well, that's fine. When you get a PhD, you can tell me otherwise. I mean, I didn't really say that, but in my head, I was thinking that. And then again, I started to listen to them and I was like, that's true. Actually, that doesn't make any sense. Like a lot of things that just, the research is just, scientific research is obviously by design, very simplistic by design. So I'm starting to pause a lot and wonder, should I even be talking about the evidence for these recommending different teaching practices based on quote unquote evidence? I mean, if we're fundamentally studying an issue in a petri dish, then how is that going to be relevant in your classrooms? So to take a case to give you an example here, the research says that we should not be praising students for their intelligence. We should only be praising for effort. And so I tried doing that, and the students pushed back and said, well, what are you talking about? What about affirmations? And I said, well, affirmations can be a type of fixed mindset. So no, the research would say not to do that. And people just didn't buy that. They would push back and say, sometimes I'm feeling really down and I just need someone to tell me that I'm smart. Sometimes I struggle with anxiety. I struggle with depression, and I'm not going to, suddenly think that I can't do something when it gets hard just because my friend comforts me, and so that's just a tiny example of when you dig a little deeper beyond the research, you're like, yeah, this is not really speaking to people's real world experience. And so, for instance, now when we talk about praise, I will say, look, if you want to praise them for their intelligence, awesome, go ahead and do that, but do it with growth mindset praise. You can do both. You can say, I think you're super smart, but that intelligence is going to get you nowhere unless you put in a lot of effort. The real world is just way more complex than these experiments that we do would lead us to suggest. A lot of things are just much more complicated. Another example of that is what are called seductive details. And a lot of the cognitive literature, they'll claim that you shouldn't put interesting pictures and images and videos on your PowerPoints because they distract. Dozens of studies have shown this. Dozens. It's a pretty decent effect size. But when I do this in classes, students love it. It's a nice little brain break. They feel like, okay, I can breathe. You appear relatable. So I actually studied this. I did a research study on seductive details, and I compared the effectiveness of seductive details in a typical laboratory environment versus in a more, what I would call an environment that's a little bit closer to the classroom. And what I actually found was that indeed in the laboratory environment, they don't work so well, but in the classroom environment, they work great. And so I think a lot of what we study as cognitive psychologists and psychologists more generally, we really need to bring into the classroom because the classroom is just way more complex. And I've just been continuously impressed by students and less impressed by the research, actually, to be quite honest. It's just so simplistic. And so I just really try to listen to students when they tell me this doesn't work. And I try to broaden my perspective beyond research. I now present theoretical frameworks and authors, and I read people who just have strong opinions who are not scientists. And I say, let's think about this.
That was terrific and very validating for me as someone that's feeling a little just kind of bored of my lab life and thinking, I love memory and I love teaching. Why am I not doing those things together? So I feel like that was a perfect for me suggestion, and hopefully for listeners as well that are sometimes feeling a little stuck. And I love that study that you described, that it might be bad in the laboratory, but in your classrooms, please feel free to be interesting and make that space.
Yeah, the interest part is so foundational. Before I thought interesting, I'm presenting you with the latest science. That should be interesting enough, because it's interesting to me. But yeah, a lot of them, our college classrooms require someone to manage their attention. So I teach high school people who are going to become high school students and teachers, and I tell them, you got to manage your students' attention. You can't assume they're going to do it for you. You'd like that, but you have to take a role in that. You got to look at the classroom as a spider web. And, the student's attention is not the spider. It's in the web. You got to jiggle the web here and there to get the spider to attend to things, And so in the same way, I try to do the same thing in my classrooms. I think this idea of managing attention is very controversial among professors because they think, whoa, what the heck? I didn't sign up to babysit these brats. But to be quite honest, they need a lot of management. And I don't see that as a deficit. To me, that's just who human beings are. I get bored too. I would love it if in faculty meetings, my chair would do a backflip or something, I would love that. Why? Not because I've got ADHD or because I'm deficient, because I'm a human being and I get bored, and so do my students, and that framework has really changed my perspective from you're an autonomous adult. You need to manage your own attention to know this classroom is your web. And my job is to set up a situation where your attention is being co-managed by me, by your peers, by the material. And yeah, it's just a very big transformation since I've been working with teacher ed students. I would encourage all of you who are teaching psych classes to teach a class in an ed department. You'll grow a lot, and maybe it'll be a positive thing, because it definitely wasn't for me at first, but now it definitely is.
Great. Yes. All right. Challenge accepted. I'll go. They're just on the 4th floor for me, so they're easy to find.
Good.
Well, I just want to thank you just so very much for giving of your time and your really cool research and just life experience. I really feel the benefit, which is I'm recording this right before we go on our Thanksgiving break, so you're adding to my reasons for Thanksgiving.
Oh, great.
I have been talking today with Dr. Gerardo Rarmiez from Ball State University. Thanks for listening. Listeners, did today's episode make you realize you have a question you would like someone to answer? I would be happy to take it into consideration and find a guest that can help. But what I need you to do is head over to our Google form at bit.ly/AskPsychSessions.